We have an awful lot of material covered in these textbooks on the topics of social work values, ethics, and professionalism. And so this is sort of a summary of some of the main points of the various readings associated with this in your syllabus for this week. Both, we've talked over and over again about the need to be aware of our own values and where they come from and how they influence us. Not only the values that we hold consciously, but also those that are kind of within us, that are a part of us and inculcated in us before we even have an awareness of such a thing as values. Because of the fact that we're American and because we belong to the ethnic group that we belong to, and because we're either male or female, and we're either Alaskan or not, and whether or not we were raised in a family that had to struggle to make ends meet versus one that was much more comfortable socioeconomically. All of those kinds of things have a major bearing on the kinds of values that are really the foundation of our being, and oftentimes, or maybe the best word is preconscious, where it's not even something that we think about. It's just the basis for our reality. And so we bring our personal values to our work with our clients, and then also in the process of our social work education, we learn about professional values, and we have to kind of line up our personal values and our professional values. Not necessary that they have to agree all of the time, but certainly they have to align in a certain way that enables us to do our work effectively, and respecting our professional values along the way. So we should be aware when our personal values are in lockstep with social work professional values, or whether they clash with the values of that profession. And also keep in mind that the clients that we serve, with all the variety of different backgrounds that they come to us with, very definitely will have different values as well that are divergent from what we are familiar with personally or professionally. So self-awareness is one of those things that early on in our education we learn about as being very important, and it certainly is in this particular topic. Now, as a professional, you're somebody who must possess the skill, knowledge, expertise, standards, or expertise that are associated with the field, and be competent and efficient, but also be able to recognize and separate out personal and professional existences in our lives, and to act within the professional sphere when we interact with our clients. Competent and trustworthy social workers benefit society and improve the reputation of the profession of social work. But when we lack professionalism, first of all, of course, it's very possible that it will harm our clients, and the policies and programs and practices may also have something to do with our lack of professionalism, and be harmed by them as well. And funding sources might not support our services if we don't have a professional approach to things. So we have to really be prepared to demonstrate the qualities that help to set us apart from others as we go about our work. Now, there are different characteristics of professionalism. Some of these come from the social work code of ethics, but others are different kinds of qualities or whatever that also associated with the professionals in a more general sense. So the first one that we talk about here is integrity, which involves honesty, truthfulness, sincerity, humility, and trustworthiness. So the code of ethics includes integrity as one of its core values, and adherence to the values and ethics of the profession, and to its fundamental moral principles such as sincerity and fairness and truthfulness, dedication, reliability, loyalty. These are all central to professional integrity, and we have to presume integrity. It involves exceptional power and influence, but also carries with it an enormous amount of moral responsibility. And so in practicing our craft in a professional manner, we need to do the kinds of things that are mentioned here, such as keep our promises, maintain some humility, be able to acknowledge our mistakes sincerely, to be able to acknowledge our mistakes, be honest about our knowledge, skills, and areas of competence. I think that's the transparency in the workplace. Being able to tell our clients and colleagues the truth at all times. Self-understanding and self-control, another characteristic of a professional. Without them, we might sometimes act out unresolved personal issues in professional settings or behave inappropriately without understanding why necessarily. Self-understanding, self-control reflect the ongoing processes of maturing through which we grow personally and professionally through our life. So we should appreciate how our personal beliefs, our attitudes, and ideologies might influence or interfere with our professional activities. So sometimes as we go about this process of self-discovery, it can give rise to very disturbing thoughts or feelings or those kinds of things. And at times it might be necessary for us to regulate our inner thoughts and feelings so that we can serve our clients better and advocate on their behalf. Sometimes we don't necessarily agree with clients. Sometimes we don't appreciate the lifestyle that they're leading or even their ideas or things like this. But we have to be able to manage our own responses to that, and that's one of the true hallmarks of professionalism, I think. And it's a part of the self-control and self-discipline that we have that we practice. We have an awareness of environmental and cultural context of our clients' lives. Now, this is something that isn't unique necessarily to social work, but perhaps the social work profession puts more emphasis upon environmental and cultural context than other professions do, in at least in the helping areas. So when we look at this, the term environment really is a very broad concept that includes the natural physical environment, so our atmosphere, the conditions of the city, those kinds of things, or well, actually that would be, the city would be a part of the built environment, and those human-made kinds of factors that impact us day in and day out. And then there's also the social environment, which really is about the structures and processes, cultures that surround us, and as we exist in our own environment as we go through our life day to day. So all of these circumstances influence the health of the individuals that exist within the particular environment, and affects our emotional well-being, our cognitive well-being, the length of our lives, our happiness, and so on. So one of the things that we do as a professional then is to work to influence the environment and culture so that we can promote health and justice and well-being for people. It's often said with I believe a lot of validity that any kind of social issue, any kind of environmental issue, any kind of threat to our well-being is felt much more strongly by the individuals who are poor or living in poor countries and in poor pockets and poor neighborhoods for a number of different reasons. Then we also consider family and personal factors when we work with individuals. Because the family, for instance, influences our attitudes and beliefs and values and behavior patterns, how we're raised, essentially. So even though the mass media is growing in influence greatly in the last couple of decades, human families continue to function as a major social system through which our children are socialized, learn languages, and through which culture is transmitted. Every family has an internal structure with subsystems and communication and relationship processes of one kind or another, and that's something that we must be aware of and assess and evaluate as we work with individuals as well. But it's in a lot of ways, I think family represents sort of a microcosm of the larger society and the cultures within which they function. And then these personal factors, all these kind of trait ideas or whatever about personality and psychological functioning and those kinds of things. We know about personality type, personality traits, psychodynamic theory, behavioral theory, social and cognitive theories, humanistic theories, all of these kinds of things. We're aware of them as we work with individuals, but we also understand that what goes on within the individual is greatly influenced by the environment around them. Advanced professional knowledge and expertise, of course, are essential for ethical and effective social work practice. The particular knowledge that we use in our field requires us, to have a variety of different kinds of knowledge, as you know, according to the characteristics of the setting, the particular group that we're working with, or the individuals that we're working with, the individuals that we're focusing upon, the roles that everyone assumes in both you and your client. But a common base of knowledge exists really for all social workers, thanks to the standardization, more or less, of the requirements of the social work education that has been effected by the Council on Social Work Education, CSWE. Our School of Social Work certainly works to conform to the CSWE standards and goes through reviews from time to time to ensure that it does. And frankly, that's one of the things that I think that makes the social work degree very marketable out there. Individuals who understand this recognize that if you have a social work degree from one of the CSWE accredited institutions, you've had a quality education. And also another thing that I think we mentioned self-efficacy in this slide, and one of the things that does, I guess, is that gives us self-efficacy, enables social workers to be collaborative agents of change. We have to take steps within our own work to effect change for our clients, effect change in the agencies and the systems within we work. So we have to be ready to advocate, and that means that we have to have some sense of self-efficacy as well in our work. Finally, just in this list, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any stretch, but we also approach service from a person and environment perspective that involves us identifying, assessing, and intervening in the social systems in the client's lives, so that we're not just focusing upon what's happening inside the client or looking to just adjust the client to conform to expectations or get along better within the environment, but we look at how the environment impacts the client. And it's a mutual kind of thing, right? It isn't just a one-way street. The client also impacts the environment as well. And we need to be familiar with the resources that exist around the client, or that don't exist but need to be developed, and so that's a part of our person and environment perspective. Now, one of the things that you'll hear about frequently throughout the semester is what is referred to here as the fundamental attribution error, and this is something that that happens quite a lot even in our own thinking, which is that we overvalue the internal factors affecting the client or causing certain things, and undervalue the environmental and social factors. That's one of the dangers that happens in a psychological assessment and in accepting a diagnosis from a psychological assessment, allowing us to be overly affected by what that diagnosis is. That kind of creates a certain set of expectations that we have for the client, and also kind of puts sort of the responsibility for the situation on that client solely, without really looking at what's going on around the client that might be impacting that behavior. A good example I think they mentioned in one of the texts, or more than one of the texts, is the attention deficit disorder. Now there are medical conditions, I suppose, or at least so we've been told, that suggest that ADHD exists and has a medical basis, but oftentimes teachers determine or believe that children are overactive or hyperactive, and may make a referral for assessment and things like that, when in fact there are a lot of things that perhaps the teacher's doing in the school environment that reinforces that acting out behavior, that it isn't so much about what's going on inside the child as it is what's going on outside, and what kind of reinforcers there are, and how how the teacher responds to the child, and how the environment responds to the child on a day-to-day basis. Later on, you're gonna be reading about the importance of observing your client in their own environment, and before we make a final assessment, and this is one of the reasons for that. One of the examples that they talk about frequently. So there is just sort of a graphic from, I think this is from the Cardinal workbook, about some of the things involved in professionalism, and some of the qualities we just went through are mentioned here. Others. Other considerations are also there as well, that all have to do with how we identify ourselves as professionals in the social work field. Now, the values we were talking about a little while ago, the cardinal values of social work are established in the Code of Ethics, and there are actually, I believe, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 core values. Service and social justice are mentioned here. All human beings deserve access to the resources they need to deal with life problems and to develop to their fullest potential. We are to respect the dignity and worth of the individual and the importance of interpersonal relationships. And that dignity is inherent in an individual, and no matter who that person may be. And this includes those individuals who maybe have engaged in behaviors that are considered to be very reprehensible and maybe difficult to understand. Murderers, child molesters, those kinds of individuals, we still are to have our respect and still have dignity and worth. And when we work with them, we must approach them in that respect. Not always easy to do if you have a particular individual response to those problems, but it's still very critical for us if we're to be professionals. Integrity we talked about earlier. We behave in a trustworthy manner, that we can be believed, and that we tell the truth, and that we work transparently. And finally, the value of competence, where we really should be practicing only within the areas of our own ability, and continually work to advance our knowledge and develop more skills. Now, one of the things when we talk about values and ethics and the law, we're going to get a little discussion of the legal implications of all this, is what might harm mean in social work. Gabriel talks about a lot of times our well-meaning interventions many times cause harm to clients, even though we may think otherwise, because we haven't really done our research in terms of what's the best intervention, the best approach, how might it impact this client. So some of the procedures that are designed to protect people may actually have the opposite effect. And this includes things like, removing opportunities to do certain things by restricting freedoms, locking people up against their will for victimless crimes. Come to mind, perhaps status offenders, adolescents who are engaging in behaviors that aren't really law violations, but can bring them into the jurisdiction of the court because of the fact that the children are minors and maybe beyond the control of their parents. Sometimes those children are placed in residential facilities, and frankly, that was a part of my career early on, was working with status offenders in a residential setting. So does that help them or not to have that harm taken from them? Perhaps it protects them, but it may also do harm in other ways. Stigmatizing people with diagnostic labels, keeping clients in the dark when they have to make decisions, so that they make the decision we want and maybe not, and that we believe is best for them and might not be the one that they want to choose. Residential facilities for juveniles where excessive force by staff is used. That's one of the things when you are working with youth and you're looking at placements in facilities, is to know the facility and to know what kinds of things go on in that facility. How many complaints have there been about mistreatment by staff? What's the organization? What's the facility's policy in terms of dealing with that when it occurs? What policies are in place to protect children against any possible harm or abuse by caretakers? It's it's troubling sometimes to realize that abuse and neglect will continue in residential facilities at different times. And it's not to say that they're all bad, because and there are children who require this kind of treatment. There's no question about that. But it is as a as an agent working with an individual child, it's really behooves us to look closely at facilities before we recommend them, and as employees of such facilities to work to protect kids that are there. Nursing home facilities, one of the things that occurs sometimes in nursing home facilities is patients being over medicated in order to help control their behaviors, make it easier for staff basically to function on a day-to-day basis. And another thing you'll hear about sometimes are facilities where staff aren't properly trained to deal with, for instance, acting out residents, violent residents, and that results in harm to both the staff as well as a lot of turnover, which is harmful to the client. So there's all sorts of different ways that helping may not be helping but might be harming instead. And so we want to work to guard against that. There are certain legal obligations that helping professionals have. This is, I think, from the Cournoyer text, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these. First one is the duty of care. We are legally obligated to provide a reasonable standard of care when we deliver social services. Social workers who work with families addressing child abuse and neglect issues must be competent in both social work and child welfare practice. Engage in routine evaluation of client safety and progress toward goal attainment. These are some of the things that are minimal kinds of activities for protective services or child welfare workers to perform. And in terms of duty of care, NASW publishes standards of social work practice in some of the fields, such as child welfare, school social work with military members, veterans, and families, family caregivers of older adults, clients with substance abuse problems. So it's if you're working in those areas or considering work in those fields, I'd encourage you to get a hold of the standards for each of those areas, because they're very specific standards of care that as a NASW member and a professional social worker we should be aware of. These practice guidelines, I think, really kind of help us to know where we need to focus when we go about our work. Another part of this is that we have to take action to ensure the physical protection of clients that might be imminently dangerous to other people, imminently dangerous to themselves, or be so gravely disabled as to be unable to provide their own self-care, something that really involves more frail elderly individuals. But the first two are something that can be regarding any of our clients, danger to self, danger to others. And record keeping, good record keeping, is also connected to this duty of care obligation, because it does suggest at least a modicum of professionalism, and beyond that, it also communicates what we've done. It documents that, makes our work transparent, and enables other individuals to pick up and carry on for us if we leave our position. There's the duty to respect privacy. This includes an individual's body and physical space at home, in a residence, if they have a locker, those kinds of things, and really to respect the privacy for all aspects of personal life that is in even a symbolic region of privacy, for that matter. You can't force your clients to tell you things that are in their mind. It's their private property, so to speak. So if we do enter into private spaces, or even to those symbolic regions of privacy, we should have a very sound professional reason for doing so. Duty to maintain confidentiality. Licensed social workers, and really any social workers, all the laws require that information shared by clients remain confidential. Sometimes the term used is privileged communication, describing a legal obligation. But this has been complicated some with the advent of computerized record keeping, just because that information is so readily accessible to so many different people that it might not have been at one time. There's been some, some positives to that, in that, for instance, oversight and supervision is easier to perform with a computer system, but it also, because everyone has access to, within an agency, maybe we'll have access to each other's records, it also makes it easier for individuals to to cross over confidential lines, and read records that perhaps they have no reason doing so. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is one program that reflects federal efforts to protect the confidentiality of personal health information, and social work records fall under HIPAA. So we have to comply with HIPAA. There's the duty to inform. Social workers are obligated to educate clients about the nature and extent of the services that the worker is going to offer, and what that agency can offer. And also under HIPAA, we have to make sure that the clients are aware of our privacy and confidentiality policies as well. This should also include if you're working for a fee-for-service type of position, that you inform the client about fees, how long you think treatment's going to last, what are the possible benefits, what are the possible risks of whatever treatment's being proposed, that kind of thing. Also, this is, I think, an area where we should be able to share something about ourselves, in terms of, at least in terms of our qualifications, our fields of expertise, our training, and maybe even where our knowledge is more limited, if that's an issue. And also, I think, let clients know, this is one spot, I think, where we want to inform clients about the limits of confidentiality. And we're going to touch on a few of them in a few moments, but not only a danger to self, others, or in child abuse and neglect, but for instance, that we're going to talk to our supervisor about them, that kind of thing. Might have to give records to insurance companies when it comes time for billing purposes, for their review, that kind of thing. Duty to report. This is where, again, what I was just referring to, I guess, that we have to report to government authorities in different situations, what the laws about this vary from place to place. All states have requirements for reporting abuse and neglect of children, and also by frail elderly as well, and as a professional, that you are a required reporter in all states. Some states, everybody's a required reporter, so that if my neighbor in Indiana, if I have reason to believe that they're abusing their children in Indiana, it is my understanding that I am obligated as a private citizen to report that to the state. That is not the case in Alaska. In child welfare, professionals and individuals who work with children are obligated to have, but private individuals are not. And also, warn and protect, we have obligation to notify potential victims and take action to safeguard people that a client might harm. And in this case, and in the case of abuse and neglect, suspicion is sufficient. If we report in good faith, in most all cases, we're immune from liability under Good Samaritan laws, and that is the case in Alaska. So that if a report, for instance, is filed that you suspect a child may be being abused, and it turns out that child's not being abused, you are protected from being sued for that report. That's one of the reasons why, when child protection laws were first becoming established in the late 50s, early 60s, I believe. One of the reasons laws became necessary was because doctors were very aware of kids being abused with the kinds of patterns of repeated broken bones and things like this that their clients were turning up with, but weren't reporting them to authorities because they were concerned about being sued for malpractice and because they didn't have proof that that's what was occurring. And so the laws were established first to require that reporting, and secondly to provide some protection from persons who make such reports in good faith. So critical thinking is integral to making ethical decisions, and this, critical thinking, evidence-informed practice. Well, there's some of the qualities that we like about evidence-informed practice. For instance, we prefer truth to ignorance. It helps us to avoid bias, helps us to think carefully about our responsibilities, and causes us to think about the match between what we say we value and what we actually do. And also emphasizes the importance of honoring our obligations by drawing on practice research involving clients as much as possible as informed participants. So informed consent, one of those things that is a phrase we're familiar with, and among the kinds of things that are required for informed consent, first of all, that there's no coercion, and that's rather obvious, I think, or any kind of undue influence necessarily to have the consent given. Generally, it has to be in writing. We should be describing the benefits and discomforts or risks of proposed services. Also, the benefits and risks of alternative methods. If there are methods that some people believe, and this is one of the things about your research, a good study is going to include those who disagree or those who have other conclusions or whatever, just so you can compare that and be aware of that. And in this particular case, if there are other methods that could be used but you're not choosing them, what are the benefits and drawbacks to each of those? Does the client have the ability to provide consent? And if not, then is there a guardian or authorized representative to provide that consent for that person? Informed consent should be clear and complete about what your interventions will be, what the purposes of the intervention. In a language, and I don't mean just the language, but in a way of speaking that the client understands, using common language and not a lot of professional jargon. We should offer to answer any questions and advise clients that at any time they are free to withdraw their consent and withdraw from treatment and participation at any times. Now, interestingly, all of this seems rather obvious, And Gambrel points out, and she does this many times throughout the book, that even though we say we usually follow informed consent, we don't usually follow informed consent requirements. And that's just something that it's worth keeping in mind. Key ethical principles from the social work code that we value. I mean, some of the strongest ones include the right of client self-determination, of the obligation to provide informed consent, that we preserve professional boundaries with our clients, that we don't have dual relationships and we don't engage in inappropriate interactions with clients on personal levels or even professional levels for that matter. That we safeguard confidentiality of clients in all ways possible. Now, there are some limits to confidentiality mentioned here, and we've been talking about this, and I think we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail. But one of those things that I think a lot of times we forget to tell our clients is that okay, let me get back to that. We fail to tell our clients sometimes that we're going to talk over their case with our supervisors, and particularly in smaller communities, that may be an issue of concern to the client. So it's something worth keeping in mind. It is one of the reasons why I think I mentioned in another talk that I had a client driving over from Seward to Kenai, in the wintertime through the mountains, 2.5 hours, because of concerns about privacy and Seward, which is even smaller than Kenai, and you know, several different times that occurred over the years. And so it's something also that we're going to consult with others if we're in private practice. Hopefully you're not practicing in isolation, but you still have supervision, or you have at least regular consultation groups in one way or another. We should be careful about confidentiality and how we record things too. And there are some things that are worth keeping in mind here. Now, record keeping is something that I don't know if we have any particular training about how to keep records, and I really think we should have somewhere along the line, because I've seen such a wild variety of record keeping techniques among individuals, both in the social with the social work degree and those without. And one of the requirements, one of the things we have to be able to do to keep good records is to be able to ferret out what is critical, what is important to record, and what is irrelevant. And I've had some staff members over the years, several staff members over the years, who were just so worried about leaving out important things. Okay, oh my. All right. I think I apologize for the interruption. Again, I think I was talking about employees who were just so worried about leaving things out that might be critical, that literally it seemed like everything got put into the notes. And while there may be some entertainment value in reading that, you know, it for one thing, it makes record keeping much more difficult and much more likely to occur, because record keeping takes so long that way. Secondly, it reflects, I believe, you know, an inability really to recognize what's important in your work. And so, anyway, I like the first line, which says, record no more than is essential for the services being provided. That's a time-saving issue. It's also protection for the client, because there's a lot of extraneous and irrelevant material that can go in there that, you know, can be used against the client at different times. So you wanna make sure that all that irrelevant information is omitted. Verbatim or process recordings should not be included in case files. Now, what you do and what you might keep and not put in case files is another issue, and I think you would want to talk to your supervisor before you had any kind of separate files, because I think that's pretty much considered unethical, and would recommend that you know, take that particular suggestion, you know, with an asterisk beside it, and look at that further. Sometimes you have to keep verbatim recordings because of the type of situation you're involved in. Perhaps you know, a forensic interview with a child who you know, was sexually abused or may have been sexually abused, and sometimes those things have to be revealed in court. You know, so you can't just like set them aside and lock them up somewhere necessarily. Maintain and update records. Make sure you have dictation facilities, if you're dictating, that are soundproof and, you know, private. Make sure you protect data. This means don't leave your client records or sitting out on your desk, or if it's in a computer, that you leave your desk with your computer open for other people to walk in and read it. If you have file cabinets, that those cabinets be locked at night, that your office door be locked at night in addition. That any transmission through technology is secure. If you fax documents, one of the things you always want to do is make sure that the person says they'll be standing at the fax to receive it. A lot of stuff sent over email is not secure unless it's sent through encrypted measures, and there are services now that most of us have access to that allow us to send such files securely through encryption. Keep clients informed as to what information is saved, when it might be disclosed, and for what its purpose would be in disclosing that information. I mean, I could spend you a couple weeks talking about record keeping and storage, and again, that's another area where sadly, you know, we're often not careful enough about how we do that. With children, is another reason to not record more than you have to, because kids sometimes are going to tell you things in confidence, and if it's not relevant to the particular situation, you don't necessarily want to record things in there that, because parents have a right to review their children's files. And that's now they're that's one of those dilemmas, because as a parent, I want to know what I need to know about my child so that I can protect my child and take proper action. But at the same time, as an adolescent, I want to know that if I tell you that I had sex with my girlfriend last night, that's not necessarily going to get back to my mom and dad if that's not relevant to the treatment. So those kinds of things, I always make sure that I let adolescents know that their parents have a right to their records, but that I try to be careful about what's put in those records. So when information has to be shared because of the law, danger to self, danger to others, suspected abuse or neglect, or so on, clients always should be informed of that when you're doing that. And I say here that this should be a part of your role induction when you're talking over, what's your relationship with what you expect your relationship with your client to be like, what you will do, what you won't do, what your client might do, what the client might not do, those things. One of the things you talk about is this duty to inform, so that your relationship is confidential, but with certain exceptions. And this is where you're going to include things like, I'm going to talk over your case sometimes with my supervisor, and reviewers may come in and look at your files, for particular reasons, that kind of thing. The duty to warn thing, the need to protect. A report if the client's a danger to self or others. You may have heard of to others, actually, the Tarasoff case. There was a university psychologist who worked with a guy who said he was going to go kill his girlfriend, I believe. And if I recall this correctly, and it may not be entirely true, the university psychologist did not inform the potential victim. Seems to me they may have informed law enforcement. I'm not sure, he may have, or whatever, but in any event, the victim was murdered by the boyfriend, and the family of the victim sued and won against the university because the psychologist did not inform the victim. There is a long list of possible limitations of confidentiality and gambrel on page 50 to, I didn't finish that, but I think it goes on for like a couple of pages. Other things include, like, for instance, if many of the situations you run into are going to be involved in the legal system, and so you may have to testify in court, and it's something you might want to advise a client of. If there's an emergency, you may have to violate confidentiality, in order to protect that client, those kinds of things. So this is something that perhaps is depends on the context of your treatment, but nonetheless, we should inform our clients about the possible limitations. We really need to be aware of the laws in our state, because things like HIV infection, for instance, and I was digging around trying to find something that would tell me when we're there in Alaska, and perhaps you know this already, but if a client is sexually active and tells you that they have AIDS and that they're not protecting themselves, are you legally obligated to report that or not? That kind of thing. Are you legally obligated to report HIV infection to the health authorities? At one point, I think it said that it had to be reported within 5 days. But again, that's something that I think I would encourage you to talk over with your supervisor before any report is made. Any profession, including the profession of social work, has a code of ethics. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of a profession is, and the code of ethics, it really is the way that the profession sort of polices itself or manages itself. And so, in order, if you run into a situation where a colleague is engaging in unethical behaviors, we're supposed to first talk it over with the colleague And if there's no remedy in that, then report to a supervisor. But at some point, you may have to report to the NASW. And again, it's going to depend a lot upon what the law says and things like this. But our values and ethics do report that we intervene, or do require that we intervene when we're aware of a colleague that's acting unethically. Now, when we talk about our own behaviors and things like this, there are professional ethical considerations. There are also legal considerations, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. They're not necessarily the same thing by any means, though. But negligent behaviors, willful behaviors that violate ethical codes and professional standards, and that prove to be harmful to the client, is what's known as a malpractice. And in legal services, it's a civil tort, and your client can bring damages, or can seek damages against you for willful or negligent behaviors. And well, we're going to touch on a couple of them in a minute, but there are 3 different forms of malpractice that's mentioned in our book. Is malfeasance, which is an intentional engagement in a practice that's we know to be harmful with a client. There's misfeasance, which involves making a mistake in the application of an acceptable practice. And nonfeasance, which really involves us failing to apply a standard or acceptable practice when we should have been applying that standard. One of the things that this says to me is, this is one of the reasons why we have to be sure that we're competent to do what we're doing in our work. Even making mistakes sometimes, if it's a serious enough a mistake, could wind up you being reported for malpractice. And first, I'm going to go to the bottom part here first. More than reports about malpractice, what you're going to find when you work in agencies is a complaint. And sometimes the complaint is, most of the times actually, the complaint is just filed within the organization itself. And you should see if your organization has a complaint procedure if you're not familiar with it, and be familiar with it, so that when an individual has a complaint, you handle it ethically and responsibly according to your agency policies and procedures. There are a lot of errors and I pulled this off of another website, this particular section, and there were a few more kinds of things, but some of the things that we do sometimes, that when we get a complaint that we don't do properly, or we whatever, and the complaint becomes more serious, is, first of all, that we fail to empathize with the anxiety involved with the complaint. We should try to tune into what's going on with the client that's behind the complaint, and let the client know we're listening and hearing what's being said. And if the complaint is about our own behaviors, of course, it can be pretty difficult. We're going to be defensive, oftentimes in our roles. And so this is where it really is high professionalism involved in being able to hear that information and to try to practice some empathy in dealing with it. Sometimes if you do that resolves the issue. Sometimes we jump to conclusions before we really do the investigation, if we're investigating somebody else's complaint. Sometimes we promise responses within time frames that just aren't realistic given our other duties, and in order to appease the complainer. Sometimes we're just so legalistic about things that there's no way that the client can derive any satisfaction from it. We deal with the complaint, resolve it, we deny it, we approve, whatever, we accepted, whatever it might be, and the client, that process maybe ends, and the client finds no satisfaction in it, even though all the steps of the complaint process are handled according to Hoyle. But maybe the biggest thing is just simply not giving an honest apology for what happened or for the impact of the behavior. Now, there are all sorts of things that, and again, this list here, this at the top of the page, the risk of complaints or litigation increases when professionals engage in misbehavior. And there are maybe five of the hallmark kinds of things that often results in litigation: treatment without consent, professional incompetence, failure to maintain currency with advances in the knowledge base, not staying up to date with what's going on in your field, failure to prevent a client's suicide, battery or sexual impropriety on the part of the professional, heaven forbid. But again, this is, I think, in the Cardinal workbook. I mean, there's a list of probably 24 different kinds of things beyond this, failure to report abuse or neglect, even causing a client's suicide. Sometimes people have been accused of that. Sexual improprieties, breaches of confidentiality, invasions of privacy, violation of civil rights, false imprisonment or arrest. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, those kinds of things. So there's just a whole number of different things, a long list of things that we can do. But, there's a simple solution to this, and it's an oversimplification, but there is a sort of a simple solution to this that we're going to touch on in a moment here. But if you're already getting worried about how on earth can you practice under these circumstances, this is one of these realities, And I will tell you, by the way, that if you're working for an agency and you're following agency policy, and you have the manual and this is why you have to know what your agency's policies are. And if you work for OCS, for instance, you've got a manual that is, I don't know, if I remember right, 600 some pages. I mean, it's gigantic. And in fact, one of the attorneys in Kenai said one time that the manual, that what it was really good for was making sure that this is a defense attorney, that his clients had grounds to sue for failure to follow policy, because it was almost impossible, he said, for anybody to know what all the policy is, because first of all, the policies are always changing. You have to keep your manual up to date, those kinds of things. But anyway, as long as you're following your agency's policies, generally speaking, your agency should be able to defend legally any kind of legal thing brought against you because of your practice. Again, that's something you want to make sure is clear, and would talk with the your attorney or your agency's attorney in management about that. But if you're not following agency policy, you're going to be on your own. So it's important for you to know what agency policy is, and particularly for those of you in private practice, as well as those who are employed by agency, you might consider malpractice insurance. NASW offers it to its members at really pretty inexpensive, and if you ever, heaven forbid, if you're ever involved in a malpractice lawsuit, they would be there to help you with that. What this says, good practice is the best defense, so there's a reason why we need to know what we're doing, and why we need to be aware of our policy, and why we need to be respectful of our clients. And one other thing here, I mentioned this slide, by the way, having been a supervisor for a number of years throughout my career, actually, but particularly in the later years of my practice, it's a lot harder than it looks. And one of the reasons for that is because, as a supervisor, you're responsible for the actions of your staff. So if your staff fail to exercise due diligence in their work, you can be sued as well, because you're supervising that person. And it's a difficult aspect of supervision for you, and it's one of the reasons why you have to be very, very cautious about who you hire if you have those decisions to make, because you need to be able to hire people that you can count on to do a good professional job. And sometimes that's harder than you might guess. So there are a number of different methods for understanding and resolving ethical dilemmas between the different textbooks, and this is Hepworth's 7 steps in ethical decision making out of that text, which really starts with identifying the problem and then evaluating the process at the end, and a number of different things that, what are the principles or competing and the competing issues that are at play here. How does the code of ethics apply? What do the laws and regulations say? Consult with colleagues, with supervisors, legal experts. Consider the possible courses of action. What if I do this? What if I do that? What are the pros and cons of each? And this is one of the things that this is a good model that I hope you'll use when we get to the ethics, assignments that you're going to have, is be able to evaluate based upon something like this. And then, of course, you decide on a course of action, develop a strategy. Now, another model that I think this is comes from the workbook is the ethic model, and you see ETHIC at the beginning of each. I don't know that would help me remember these things, but very much the same thing, just kind of wrapped a little differently as the Hepworth model. Frederick Reamer is somebody, if you ever do any reading on social work ethics through NASW, Reamer is one of the experts on ethics in the social work profession, and I've done some of his online workshops, for my CEUs for ethics training. And he has a 7-step model here. Examine the issue, or rather identify the issue, identify the individuals that are likely to be affected. This is something that isn't necessarily specified in Hepworth's model. And identify the different courses of actions, participants, and benefits and risks of each. Talk about the reasons that favor and oppose each possible course of action. Consult with colleagues, experts, supervisors. Make your decision. Document your decision-making process. Documentation is a very helpful thing in these dilemmas. And then monitor and evaluate how it turns out. Now, these ethical dilemmas are often very vague, and there isn't one answer necessarily for many of these situations you're going to find yourself in. The elements of the ethical code at times contradict each other, and so this is where you have these dilemmas that you have to resolve, and so there isn't a clear-cut answer sometimes for these things. If you can show, if you're able to describe the process you go through in reaching your conclusion, should your final decision ever be challenged, you're going to stand in good ground if you can spell out how you've done that. So I'd say, find a method and follow it, use it. And here's another one, very much, again, very similar in many respects, but this also suggests looking at other factors involved, like, your agency policies and standards of practice, those kinds of things. Documentation is a part of all of these, though, as I notice. So, like I was just saying, conforming to one standard might violate another, and so this is where you have to put on that critical thinking cap, and keep practicing critical thinking, and it will be more natural to you than it might be at the beginning. One way to maybe sort through competing ethical standards involve this principles screen, ethical principles screen that Dogoff and his colleagues came up with, and it's a hierarchy basically of ethical values, and so it might be of some benefit. And the top, number one level, protecting human life, is first and foremost the most important thing, and then according to this particular level of screening, then it goes down in terms of importance. So another tool perhaps that you can use, this is out of the I'm pretty sure this is from Cournoyer. Saying that name is a little like saying rural, it's just there's too many whatever sounds that is. Now, We have ideologies in our practice, and sometimes they can compromise services and also cause us to participate in maintaining inequalities. So, for instance, like an American ideology that I mentioned here is individualism, which says, well, basically that, we should all take care of ourselves, and we pride ourselves on being individuals in the American culture. Of course, that's not the case in many cultures around the world, but it is here. Um, and people say, they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, and they earned their own keep and all of that, and we raise our kids to do that. And yet, this is also the same value that's used to really advance capitalism. That the winners are the people who deserve the tax breaks and deserve the luxuries, and the workers are the ones who aren't doing so well. And if they're not doing well, anybody can do this. Anybody can succeed in America, and if you're not doing well, it's your own fault because of individualism. And so this is how that particular ideology can be really turned against us. And if we subscribe to ideologies like that, we can really sometimes really look down on our clients who aren't doing well. The textbook that I teach the social welfare class out of is Phyllis Day's New History of Social Welfare, and I know I've mentioned that to you before, and perhaps you worked out of that book yourself in that class. She has 9 American values that we look at early in the course, and these are values that are all American, and yet they're also twisted and turned against the needy. Gambrell says that relying on ideology, in her example, appealing to professional values and the good intentions of a professional, relying on ideology in place of critical discussion is questionable ethically when it compromises the quality of services to clients. So, appealing to authority to support claims may be less preferable than using a theory to pose a testable hypothesis. This is the thing again, well, so-and-so says, or, Reamer's model is, like I was just saying, or, my professor in such and such a class taught us that, that it's all well and good and it may impress some people, but it may be better to take a theory and test it out, see if it really holds true or not. Pronouncements are like propaganda, again, if they're used in place of critical examination of any kind of claims of effectiveness, for instance. And the ideology, propaganda, these kinds of things, reliance on authority, they play on our reluctance to raise questions, she says. The ideology of mental illness is a great example of this, because the ultimate effect of that, the whole idea of mental illness, is that there's a whole population of people out there who are deprived of their freedom and their liberty because they've been labeled mentally ill, and treatment is in some respects is forced upon them, or they're convinced to engage in treatment, rather than looking at the possible environmental causes that may create those particular problems, discrimination being the one that Gambrell talks about a lot. So dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, often reflect ideological clashes, and that's something else maybe to think about when you're examining ethical dilemmas, is what are the ideologies behind these, behind your thinking. Obstacles to ethical practice include the emphasis on the sanctity of professional opinion and the unquestioned assumption that professionals are sincere and that they always want to do good. When we're talking about our goals and procedures and expected outcomes with clients, if we're vague about that's an obstacle to ethical practice. A lot of times we are vague because we're worried about success rates. Maybe our funding depends upon a certain number of clients that show improvement, and those kinds of things. And really what it does is it shields the practitioner or the agency, and in ways sometimes it's not always in the client's best interest. Gambrell would like to see us have more descriptive studies of ethical dilemmas and how they're resolved. I think her thinking is why do we have to keep reinventing the wheel? Let's record what we're doing, publish these things. And it's some of our ethical dilemmas maybe are common enough, they occur enough that, we would benefit from having more studies of ethical dilemmas like this to help us reach a decision clearly, give us some guidelines at least on how to resolve particular dilemmas. Now, a lot of times ethical dilemmas are very individual and very personal, and I'm not saying we should put a cookie cutter kind of template over them, but she's a point here. We need to track these things more carefully, I think. And somebody else, Gambrel, I think, talks about having students who say they don't make decisions in their work. And I know people who were in our program years and years ago who worked for OCS who said that you can't do social work when you work for OCS, and I just couldn't believe I could hear somebody in a master's program say that kind of thing. And I don't know what their definition of social work was, but there's no better place to do social work than in an organization like that. Now you have a lot of restrictions because of the bureaucracy and the different kinds of legal responsibilities that you have and everything. Sometimes it conflicts with what you think you would like to do, you prefer to do, but you're still doing very, very important social work in that and similar kinds of jobs. But never say we don't make decisions, because we do make decisions, and taking responsibility for our decisions is one of those things that kind of, well, it is, like it says here, it's a hallmark of being a professional. Finally, a little bit about morals. The fundamental moral principles exist according to most philosophers, and that these moral principles should guide our decision making in every aspect of our life, and this would include in our professions. And so there are certain fundamental moral principles that have been adopted by some helping professionals, and here are some of these things that you can reflect upon as we tie up this particular lecture. Non-malfeasance, confidentiality, justice, beneficence, autonomy, privacy, and fidelity. These are some of the things we've been talking about as far as ethics are concerned. You can put other words on them, and it'll tie right into the lecture. But these are things that I think, principles that we need to be aware of and subscribe to, keep close to our thinking and our hearts as we go about our work. Okay, that's it for this particular lecture, and I'm hoping that there's some things in here that are useful to you. Let me know if any questions arise, and we'll be talking again soon.